We're at 1 o'clock, so let's get started. Kia ora, everyone. My name's Sylvie. I'm my HR's Chief Evangelist, and it's a joy to be here with you on this lovely Wednesday afternoon doing an Ask Me Anything webinar. So if you've been to our webinars before, you know that typically we have a topic. I'll do a short presentation, maybe 30 to 35 minutes, then some time for Q&A at the end. We have had so many questions coming through off the back of our recent webinars. So again, thank you if you're attending and getting in touch with us, that we thought it might be a good idea to just do a one-off Q&A session. We call them Ask Me Anything, where you can just fling questions at me and I'll do my best to respond. What that means is I don't have a presentation today. I will be giving you some updates on the review of the Holidays Act, so just a bit of a quick chat about some stuff that might be coming up. But then the floor is yours, really. It's your session today. We will be trying something a little bit different. We know that it can be a bit tricky to be listening and taking notes at the same time if you've put a question through. So once we've got the recording at the end of the session, we will then get a transcript of that and then do our best to put together like a Q&A fact sheet that we'll share around afterwards. So hopefully that makes it a bit easier to be present and listening and paying attention rather than trying to take notes and trying to scrabble as we go through. So please send your questions through if you've got a difficult person you're managing, if there's a difficult process, if you've got questions about how the Holidays Act works, if you've got questions about managing something like a trial period termination. I'm here to help, and today's content really is all about what you bring to the session. So a little bit of housekeeping. As always, we will be recording this webinar and making a recording available afterwards. So if you do need to duck away and take a phone call, or if you can't stay the whole way through, that's fine. You'll have access to a copy of it afterwards. And if you do ask a question, remember that you are asking it in a public forum. So try not to use any identifying details. You can ask questions anonymously if you want to. If you'd like me to follow up with you afterwards, just include your name so I know who it is. But again, that recording will be there and probably that transcript. So try not to say, Sylvie Thrush Marsh of my HR in Auckland is a terrible employee and I'm having a horrible time managing her. I'll do my best to scrub any of those kinds of identifying details so you've got an extra layer of safety there. But do just remember you're asking questions in a public space. I think that's everything for us to kick off with. So what I will do is just start going through this brief Holidays Act update to give you some time to get your questions through, and then we can jump into whatever is top of mind for you. So the Holidays Act is a bastard of a piece of legislation to apply. If you've ever had employees who don't work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, you know how frustrating it can be sometimes. And there have been many, many high profile cases of large organizations getting things like holiday entitlements wrong and managing final pays incorrectly. There was the Nova Pay system that the teachers used for many years was not working so well. The police in New Zealand, MB, have all had to make payments or backdate payments to employees who no longer work for them because they had to do a whole big review of how their payroll was working. So the previous government committed to doing a review of the Holidays Act and came out with a bunch of recommendations last year. This government has picked up that torch and is running with it. They, of course, are making some changes and amendments to the recommendations that the previous government adopted, which isn't any surprise. If you want more detail on that, there are plenty of resources online. But in terms of where we're at now, there is some targeted consultation that is underway with a select group of 100 organisations and businesses and stakeholders to get their feedback. That included employers, it included people with different work arrangements, it included a couple of payroll providers, as I understand it. So they're doing their best to get feedback from as many people as will be affected by this as possible to get guidance on how the law might work in practicality to manage some of those challenges. So that kicked off in September last month. So we're a month into this targeted consultation process. Once targeted consultation closes, there'll be an analysis of the submissions received. That advice will go to the minister, and then they'll decide what to do if they do further policy work or if they're ready to introduce a bill to Parliament. And then, of course, that will go through the standard select committee process with submissions open to the public. So consultation happening at the moment as a bit of kind of behind the scenes pre-prep work, if you like. That'll then go to the minister. They'll decide whether to do more policy pre-work or whether it will go to Parliament as a bill, and then we'll kind of see how it goes from there. So nothing changes to the way that you are paying and managing pay in your business at the moment. Nothing is different. But in terms of what the draft bill might include, the focus really is around simplifying calculations for figuring out what someone earns and reducing the amount of complexity around figuring out some of these entitlements. So a couple of headlines that the government's put out includes an approach to prorating sick leave. So at the moment, if you're a permanent employee, whether you work 1 day a week or 5 days a week, you get 10 days of sick leave for every 12 months that you work after your 6-month mark. The new bill would probably include a version of if you work 50% of an FTE, you get 50% of those sick days. So an employee who works 5 days a week, 5 days a week would get 10 days sick leave a year. Someone who worked 2.5 days a week, so half that amount of time, would probably look at getting 5 days of sick leave a year. So that's one of the changes. They'd be looking to move from an entitlement system to an accrual system for annual leave. So rather than employees having to wait 12 months before their accrual becomes entitlement, that annual leave is available to them from day one as accrual. So there's no stand down period essentially. Some objective criteria for using pay as you go for annual leave, and some simpler methodologies for calculating the use of leave. So again, nothing is changing. We don't have any formal confirmation that this is what it's all going to look like, but certainly some signs that there will hopefully in 2025 be a bill introduced, which makes the Holidays Act just a bit easier to navigate. So that is my very brief update on something that a lot of us have a fair bit of interest in. I'm going to jump back in and see what questions have come through, and we'll get started. So Anonymous asks, hi Anonymous, thank you for joining us. I think there'll be a few Anonymouses today, so thank you for coming along. Mental health and absences, do these situations count as sickness? How do we best support these workers and still get them to work without having EAP services to offer? That is a really, really excellent question, so thank you for raising it today. So sick leave can be used for circumstances where someone is mentally unwell. They might have a diagnosis of depression or anxiety. They might be going through a really difficult divorce or some really challenging personal circumstances, and they're not well enough to work. They don't have a broken arm and they don't have a cough or a cold, but they're not well enough to work for whatever reason. So employees can use sick leave when they are not mentally well enough to work. So if you have an employee who doesn't have a pattern of absences, but is going through something difficult personally, maybe they have recently experienced a bereavement, maybe their child has just had a really difficult health diagnosis, whatever the issue is. If they say to you one day, look, I'm just not up for coming in, can I take a mental health day and can I take it as sick leave? You don't have to, in those circumstances, I would recommend you do accept that request for sick leave. They're struggling, they're having a hard time, they're not well, so they can use sick leave. That's all kind of cool. Now, where you have someone who has a pattern of absences, that's a slightly different story. If they are regularly away from work, if they are consistently not showing up, if they are showing up but respectfully being shit at their job, and they are attributing that to the fact that they are depressed or they feeling really anxious, whether they do or don't have a diagnosis. Ultimately, you can manage that situation as a medical incapacity situation. What I mean by that is if someone is not healthy enough, whether that's mental health, physical health, recovering from an injury, if they are not healthy enough to do their job, you don't have to support them forever. There's a point where you can fairly say, look, we can't continue to have this level of absences. Either something needs to change. Maybe we can agree that rather than working 40 hours a week, you work 25 hours a week because that's what you sort of tend to be doing at the moment. And then let's see how that goes. Or if for whatever reason the situation has been ongoing enough, you have just had it up to here and you've either tried to or you don't think that something like a reduced hours arrangement would work, you can propose ending their employment for medical incapacity. Now, how quickly can you move to that piece is a how long is a piece of string question. If you're a MyHR client, your employment agreements will say that you need to support someone for up to about 5 weeks with that illness or with their health. That can be in a lump, that can be over a long period of time. But basically, if you're looking to the future and with some medical information from the employee or with their involvement, it doesn't look like this is going to change for a period of time that you can't reasonably support, that's where that medical termination conversation can come into things. So quickly to recap, mental health is health. If you're not mentally healthy enough to work, employees can take sick leave, whether that's a diagnosis of depression, whether they're just having a really shit time in their personal life. If an employee isn't mentally well enough to work, they can take sick leave. Supporting those employees is a good idea in the first instance. I assume they are a good human that you want to keep around. So trusting them to tell you when they are and aren't well enough, believing them when they say that they need some support, checking in with them to see if there's anything that work can do to be supportive, whether that's temporarily reducing their workload, changing their working arrangements, whatever that might be. But ultimately, you don't have to continually support someone who isn't well enough to do the job that they've agreed to do. You can try interim measures like saying, do you just want to take 2 weeks off, use your annual leave, get yourself sorted, come back to work? That might be an option. Whether it's saying, let's reduce your hours from 40 a week to 25 a week for the next couple of months, give you a bit of breathing space and see how that goes. If none of those interim arrangements are practical, or the employee's not keen, or you don't think they would help, you can move to a point where you're saying, we're proposing to end your employment because you're not healthy enough to do your job. Seek professional guidance when you do that. Of course, it can be a bit of a delicate process, but you don't have to support them further. Peter, kia ora Peter, thank you for coming along today, asks, can sick leave be accumulated over 3 years, for example, to 30 days? Or is it a max of 10 days per year, which falls away after the end of the year? So the law says they can be accumulated to a max of 20 days. That's the cap that the law says. And then as an employer, you can choose to go above that. So a number of larger employers will say, the law says at a minimum you can accrue to 20 days, so 2.5 years of sick leave. But we're going to say we don't have a cap here at the warehouse or at PwC. You can accrue as many sick leave days as you're entitled to, and we're not going to put a cap on it. So the minimum is 20 days a year. An employee can accrue up to 20 days. If they have, let's say, 16 days of sick leave available, they hit their next entitlement, they get 4 days added to take them to 20, but they don't get those extra 6. Or as a business, you can make a choice to say, we're not going to put a cap on it and we're going to go above the 20 days. Anonymous asks, we have a delivery driver who works full-time that we're having some issues with attendance. He'll call in sick or he'll turn up late. We think he's driving as an Uber driver some evenings. We don't have any proof of this, and when the manager asked him, the employee says he does not work for Uber. We have heard through another employee that he did. How do we deal with this concern, and can we ask for any kind of proof to show he does not work for Uber, for example, his IRD earnings? So the problem is that you have an employee who's regularly calling in sick or turning up late. The reason for that doesn't really matter in the eyes of the law, whether it's secondary employment like you think is happening, whether they are going on the piss every night and just not being well enough to come in the morning, whether they are just not a very diligent person. The reason that they are not coming to work doesn't matter as much as the fact that they are calling in sick and showing up late. So I would stop trying to prove whether they do or don't work for Uber, because what you can do is hold them accountable for the fact that they keep showing up late and keep calling in sick and not coming in. So if they are regularly showing up late, I would start either a performance improvement process or a disciplinary process. Which one is going to be the better choice depends a bit on the circumstances. So get in touch if you're a client of ours. To then say, you are repeatedly showing up late to work. The reasons we don't care about. What we care about is you showing up to work on time. We're proposing to issue you with a formal written warning. We now want to hear your feedback, and then your disciplinary process kicks off. If you get to the end of that process and he hasn't given you a satisfactory explanation, you can issue him with a formal written warning. If it continues, same thing again, you go to a final written warning. If it continues, same thing again, and you go to dismissal on notice. So you can absolutely hold someone to account for not showing up to work, showing up late, not contacting you, all that kind of stuff. Don't focus on proving that he does or doesn't work for Uber. That's less important than the fact that he's not behaving in a way that is acceptable at your place of employment, and you can hold him accountable in that way. Anonymous says, if your business is currently having a pay freeze, should they publicize this to all staff or just discuss it at reviews individually with staff? There's no correct answer to that question. It depends a lot on the context and the reasons for the pay freeze. So the pros of sharing it publicly is It's business-led communication, right? So you're not going to have employees like gossiping and chatting in the background. You're getting ahead of the rumor mill, you're openly communicating what's going on. You can set the narrative around, here's why we're having a pay freeze. It's been a really difficult trading year and we just don't have the cash flow right now, or profitability is massively down for XYZ reasons, or whatever the story is. So you get to tell the story and set the terms as to why you're not having these pay rises. The cons of doing that are you will probably end up having to face a barrage of questions from your staff, understandably. You might have a bunch of disgruntled people that you kind of have to manage and be prepared to put a bit of time and energy into managing. And you might then have a set of dissatisfied people who might make choices to go look for employment elsewhere. So pros and cons. The pros of doing it privately is you get to have more, what's the word I'm looking for? Tailored or more responsive conversations with the person in front of you. They can ask questions, you can respond, you can explain why. They'll walk away from it probably feeling probably disappointed, but at least heard. They'll feel like they have a good sense of what the situation is. And then you just repeat that with everyone else. So the pros are individuals get a bit more time and attention. The cons are it takes longer. And also you then have a situation of people not knowing who doesn't know what and what everyone else knows. And so you'll end up getting potentially a bunch of back channel conversation about the pay rises, and you don't really have a chance to get out in front of that. So legally, it's kind of the same. It depends a bit on the approach that you want to take. I'd need a bunch more context to give you a recommendation. But as long as you are being open and talking about it, that's kind of the best thing. I tend to think sharing that information publicly tends to be where I would start as a default, again, unless there were other circumstances. But what's appropriate for your business and your team is going to vary depending on who's in your team, who the business is, and what the story is there. Anonymous asks, we currently do not do any drug and alcohol testing for our business. However, some of our clients do. I would like to add to our team handbook that if you are on a client site and asked to undertake a random drug test, it will be a requirement to do so. Can we add this without all team members agreeing to this inclusion? If not, how do we go about this? So it's perfectly fine for you not to have any drug and alcohol testing in your business, but your customers or your clients will do. And if you have team who are going to site, they might be, I was going to say caught up, and I don't mean that. They might be covered by the health and safety requirements and processes of that site. So how would I go about managing that? I think I would run a light touch consultation process to introduce it, because whether they have agreed to it or not, your staff are already operating under a health and safety regime that requires they may be drug tested on another site. So that is happening and it exists. They just might not be aware of it and might not have explicitly agreed to it. So because they may not be aware of it and haven't explicitly agreed, that's where that light touch consultation process comes in. Whether that's in an employee handbook, whether we add a drug and alcohol conduct clause to their employment agreements, we can do that in a letter. We don't have to do like a whole new employment agreement. Is a bit of again, I need more information, but I don't think that you can just add it to the handbook and tell everyone that that's what it is now. It is going to be a bit of a change to their understanding of the situation. So I think that consultation process is required. If your employees don't agree to it, then either you can choose not to send them to customer sites where that is a requirement. If you have that flexibility in your workload, you might not. And if you don't have that flexibility in the workload, it sort of becomes a bit of a redundancy process, because you can't change the requirements of the customer sites and you also don't have the flexibility to offer them other work. It's sort of a bit of a, well, your employment is going to end up ending because we can't support you if you don't agree to this. So a little bit of nuance there. Get in touch if you are a client. We can help you through that process. But the short answer is I don't think it's as simple as just popping a clause in the handbook. I think you will need to consult with your team about it. Anonymous asks, can an employee take sick leave if they have used all of their family violence leave, which is 10 days in total? So the short answer is If the person is sick or if they're caring for someone who is sick, that is when you can take sick leave. If it's not for those reasons, an employer can decline to agree to someone taking sick leave, and they can suggest maybe annual leave or unpaid leave instead. Having said that, if someone is dealing with the after effects of family violence, so if they have doctor's appointments, if they are injured, any of that kind of stuff, that obviously falls under sick leave, so that's fine. But if they are having to go and meet with their lawyer, if they have a hearing date, if they are having to pursue legal action against their abuser, in those circumstances, as an employer, it would be the kind thing to do to approve sick leave. But I would think that annual leave might be more appropriate in the first instance, and they have more annual leave if they're a permanent employee, so who works full time. So maybe check that out as an angle. The short answer is you don't have to approve any sick leave when someone isn't sick or caring for a dependent who's sick, but I would really strongly encourage you to find a solution that works. If the reason someone is asking for time away from work is because they are dealing with the after effects of family violence, whether that's the physical after effects or the admin process legal side of things. Cool. We have two more questions here and, oh, three, never mind. We've got a few more popping in. Ignore me. Just going to grab a drink quickly. Bear with me. So, Anonymous asks, what is a reasonable amount of time or a reasonable number of more instances of an issue to revisit the issue after doing a record of discussion to then move to a disciplinary, or how close can two disciplinaries be? And if it was discussed informally, can it be followed up informally without another event or another issue occurring? So I'll answer that last question first. So someone can't be punished twice for the same issue. So if they made a mistake and sent the wrong invoice and it was a problem for the person who is receiving the invoice, if you've discussed it with them informally and said, hey, that was a cock up, can you tell me what happened? Okay, I understand. Well, you need to pay better attention. What's your plan for doing that? I don't want to see this happen again. If you've kind of had a telling off conversation with them about it, you can't then jump to a performance improvement plan. Well, you can't jump to a disciplinary process. So if the informal conversation was, that was an issue, don't do it again, I'm pretty grumpy, I don't want to see it happen, you can't really go to a disciplinary. If the informal conversation was more of a fact-finding experience, so tell me what's happened here, what was the issue, what was the problem, why did the invoice go to the client? Okay, thank you. I'm going to have a think about this and come back to you with a plan. You've left the door open to come back with a disciplinary. That's okay, because all you were doing was understanding what had happened so you could make a decision about next steps, and that next step might involve a disciplinary process. So if the employee reasonably would consider the issue to be kind of dealt with, you can't then kick off a disciplinary process. But if you've left the door open for a disciplinary, you can come back to it. Now, the piece around what's a reasonable time between an ROD or a disciplinary or two disciplinaries depends on what the issue is. If it was a lateness issue, I would say that you would probably need 2 or 3 examples of lateness between your ROD and your disciplinary, or between your disciplinary and your disciplinary. I think a one-off instance of lateness would look like you were acting harshly to go straight from an ROD to a disciplinary, or a disciplinary to a disciplinary. If it's a bigger issue, for example, if they work in warehousing and sent 10,000 t-shirts to the wrong client, and now you're going to have to pay $500 to get those t-shirts shipped from client A to client B. Like if the cock up is bigger and has kind of bigger consequences, a one-off instance can be enough between your ROD and your disciplinary, or your disc and your disc. It sort of depends on the nature of the issue. Basically, if someone on the street thought you were being reasonable in behaving that way, you're reasonable. If someone who didn't know you and didn't know the employee was like, man, that seems a bit harsh, to this person was 5 minutes late and they went from a formal warning to from a formal written warning to a final written warning, it's going to be hard to show that you're justified in acting that way. So sorry, a bit of a piece of string answer to you there. But depending on the scale and size of the issue, once can be enough. If it's a smaller problem, you're going to need a few examples before you move on to the next process. Anonymous asks, the union is putting pressure on some of our team to join. What can we do about this, if anything? There is a collective agreement in place. Currently, out of a staff of 138, we have 12 members who are part of the union. Great question. So there are some pretty prescriptive rules around union access to workplaces. They have a right to talk to your staff. They have a right to access the workplace. They have a right to share information with your staff about the union. So in terms of resisting union pressure, I'm not clear that you would immediately have a bunch of options in front of you unless the union was kind of overstepping those rights to access the workplace. So if the union is overstepping, I can go and have a look and see what your options might be there. Off the top of my head, I'm not too sure. But beyond that, it's probably going to be a little bit more around helping the employees resist that pressure. If you have an employee who's coming to you and saying, hey, this union rep is really aggressive, they're in my ear all the time, I've told them I don't want to join and it feels like they're harassing me, you can help the employee manage that situation with the union rep, or maybe you can have a conversation with the union rep to say, hey, my understanding is that Sylvie has told you she doesn't want to join the union, kind of what's going on, and is there anything that I can do to support this relationship? But beyond that, it's going to be a bit tricky for you to manage. So sorry, not a very meaningful answer. What I will do is go and look and see if there's anything specific I can find around limiting union access to the workplace if they're putting pressure on your staff. And then when we do that wrap-up document, I'll include a bit more of a full response there. And then hopefully that'll give you some guidance. Another anonymous question. I should have known. Thank you to the couple of people who have put their names down. We have an employee that works in an area of our business where they are required to wear safety shoes. They constantly turn up to work without the required footwear, and we have paid for those shoes. We plan to send them a notification to attend a disciplinary meeting. My question is, can we send this employee home to get their shoes if they do this again and notify they will not be paid for this time? We have had many informal conversations with them about wearing the safety shoes. And in fact, when asked to wear them today, they said actually they were sick and went home. What's your advice? So the short answer is yes, you can make it a term of employment that if someone shows up to work without the correct PPE, whether that's an apron for working in a cafe or safety shoes or safety goggles, whatever the thing is, you can require that they go home to collect that item and come back, and they don't get paid for the time it takes them to leave work, go home, and then come back. So that's fine. It's also fine to discipline someone for not wearing the required PPE at work, again, whether that's a uniform or safety equipment. So I think you're totally on the money there. It sounds like it's been really frustrating to make it really clear that they have to wear this gear and for them to continue not doing so. If you wanted to step back from the severity of a disciplinary, you could have a record of discussion, so a formal documented discussion. You could have a performance improvement plan. I think you're going to end up with the same outcome there. So I think I would be supporting a disciplinary in this instance. And as part of that disciplinary process, if you don't already, you can say, going forward, if you show up to work without the required equipment, we will require you to go home, get the equipment, and come back, and you won't be paid for that time. So make sure to include that in your notification documents as a potential outcome of the process. And then if you do end up going to a warning, include that in your formal written warning letter as well. Anonymous asks, we close our warehouse on the night before a public holiday, therefore the night shift does not have to come in. Currently, we offer that team the night shift to transfer their public holiday. If they don't want to transfer their public holiday to that night, they can take annual leave if they want, or we put it through as leave without pay. We give them approximately 2 months' notice if we're closing for each public holiday. An employee has questioned this and has said if we close the branch, we have to pay him. Is this correct? If the only reason you're closing the warehouse on the night before the public holiday is because of the public holiday, yes, you have to pay any staff who don't work that day as a result of you closing when it would normally be a day that they would work. So if the public holiday is a Monday and you normally would be, running a 24/7 operation, and you close the warehouse at 10 p.m. on Sunday night, and you normally would have a night shift who'd come in at 10 and work the day through, If you have a casual employee who was pulled in to cover someone for a couple of nights because they were sick, you don't need to pay the casual for that day because it's not an otherwise working day for them. They've just been called in to fill some holes in the roster. But for anyone who regularly works a night shift from Sunday night at 10 p.m. to Monday, if the reason you're closing is because of a public holiday, you need to pay them for that public holiday, is the answer to that question. Anonymous asks, if someone asks for a rostered shift off the day after the roster has been released and they haven't applied for leave, can they have annual leave for that day, or would it count as a cash up of annual leave? I don't think it would count as a cash up. If you're in a world where you run a roster and say 5 days a week someone's rostered to work and they have 2 unrostered days, if they always have the 2 same days be rostered and they always have the same 5 days rostered, if they ask for one of those days off, I would say it would be an annual leave request. Alternatively, if you're flexible enough that you don't mind if these 2 days are actually these 2 days, or these 2 days are in the middle with a few days others. Like if your roster is flexible and you can accommodate this person just shifting their RDO from Sunday to Tuesday or whatever the request is, you can manage it that way and they can make up the time later in the week, or you can ask them to take annual leave. You have some flexibility there. So you can always say no to the request, but it sounds like you want to say yes. So if it's a day they're rostered to work, either they can shift that rostered day to another one and move their rostered day off to that day, or they can request to take annual leave and be paid out that way. Either way is fine. Can I confirm the total amount of leave an employee is entitled to? Oh, that's okay. Oh, yep, I can try. It's quite a bit there. So there's going to be a bunch of caveats to my answer here. So please take this with a big asterisk saying more detail may apply. So a permanent employee who works a set number of hours every week is entitled to a few different types of leave. So they will be entitled to 4 weeks of annual leave for every 12 months they work. They will be entitled to 10 days of sick leave for every 12 months, starting at their 6-month anniversary. That's when their first 10 days of sick leave kick in. They will be entitled to 10 days of family violence leave for every 12 months of employment, again, starting at that 6-month anniversary. If they experience a bereavement of a close family member, they will be entitled to 3 days of bereavement leave for each of those deaths. So I'm talking about family members, siblings, children, parents, that kind of thing. Those who it is specified in law, so you can go and check that. And then 1 day of bereavement leave for any other death that the employer considers kind of justifies their bereavement. So if it would be, a best friend who's passed away or a really close family friend, you can choose to approve bereavement leave for those. Annual sick, bereavement, family violence, public holidays is the other one. So if there is a public holiday which falls on a day that they would normally work, so I work Monday to Friday, so any public holiday Monday to Friday would apply to me. They get a day of paid leave for that day. In terms of other entitlements, those are kind of the main ones. Employees aren't entitled to unpaid leave, but employers can choose to approve it. Employers can choose to top up people's pay if they're required to do jury service, if they're compelled to do jury service, if they participate in, I'm going to get this wrong, but the territorial armed forces, there's like a reserve group where they take trainings and things like that. As an employer, you can choose to approve leave of different kinds for that absence. But the main ones are annual leave, sick leave, bereavement leave, and family violence leave. Those are the main paid types. I'm really working hard not to lay out all of the circumstances where that might be different, but that's the place to start. Anonymous asks, can you still go down the medical termination route if that clause is not in your employee's employment agreement? Yes, you can. So there is a lot of case law, and by case law, I mean cases that have gone before an employment relations authority member or the employment court, and decisions have been made by judges, not by parliament, but by judges. And even if you don't have a medical termination clause in the employment agreement, that person, you can still go down a medical termination route. What's tricky is that if you don't have a clause which says after 5 weeks absence, 6 weeks absence, 10 weeks absence, we'll consider medical termination. The baseline in case law is 12 weeks in total. That might be 12 weeks in a lump because they have had a really bad car accident, broken both their legs and can't come back to work for 12 weeks. That could be 12 weeks over time. For example, if they are dealing with a chronic condition like Crohn's or IBS or diabetes, and they regularly miss work because of that condition, it's 12 weeks in total. So it might be up to a year of absences in total that make 12 weeks. So the short answer is yes, you can still act. The circumstances under which you can act are a bit more generous because they come from case law. So you can still do something about it. You're just going to need to be a bit more careful about your timings than you were if it was in the employment agreement. Anonymous asks, I'm looking to upskill in my HR knowledge. Are there any courses you would recommend, like ones with the Open Polytech or something like that, which can be online or part-time as I work full-time? That's a great question. There are dozens. I would recommend that. I mean, I think on-the-job learning is the most meaningful. It can be really different learning how a disciplinary might work in a classroom compared to how it actually plays out in the real world. So if you have a chance either at your work to get involved in more HR work, or if you said you work full-time, so maybe finding an HR job's not a practical solution. But otherwise, the EMA has a bunch of really good employment relations courses if you want to know more about the stuff that we've discussed today, like how the Holidays Act worked, how termination works, kind of the pointy end of HR. Those courses are really good. We have a bunch of free resources on our YouTube channel. All of the webinars we do, we record and put up there, as well as all of the blogs on our website. Other courses, most tertiary institutions, so the Polytechs, Unitech, Auckland, like most of the large providers will have certificates or diplomas of HR or human resources management that you can take and manage that way. They tend to be a bit broader and also look at things like the psychology behind performance reviews and the theory of managing humans and theories of motivation and all that kind of stuff. So they're much more psychology informed and sort of generally informed than like a specific ERA course will be. The other place to go is the HRNZ website, so the Human Resources. They used to be HRINZ, HRNZ they are now, and they will have like one-day courses, half-day courses on particular skills in the HR world. So that would be a good place to start. I'll include a bunch of them in the wrap-up afterwards in case you're interested. But first recommendation would be get hands-on experience if you can. Second would be all of the tertiary providers will have formal diploma certificates that you can apply for. Some of them will be online, some of them won't be, so kind of pick and choose. Or third, there's a bunch of like industry resources that might be useful. Ours are really good. The EMA does a bunch of stuff, and then HRNZ would be the other place that I would go. Cool. Let's have a look. We have an employee that has been on a 6-month Army deployment in the Territorial Services. That's sort of the word I was looking for earlier. They have scheduled annual leave for a month after they return. Will their annual leave be paid out at that reduced rate due to reduced pay over the last 12 months? The answer is probably not. So your annual leave payouts to your employees need to be the greater of 2 different amounts that your payroll system will tell you. So their average pay for this person is going to be half what it normally is, right? Because they've been on leave for 6 months. So rather than having a full year's worth of earnings, they only have 6 months worth of earnings. So their average pay is reduced. But their ordinary pay remains the same. I assume that when they come back from their 6 months of leave, they'll be on the same pay rate as they were before they went. I assume that's the case. So their ordinary pay remains the same. And in terms of annual leave payouts, you're required to pay the greater of the reduced average earnings or the higher ordinary time earnings. So you'll need to pay them at the greater rate there. Would that make a difference? No, even if you'd used a particular unpaid leave mechanism to manage their time away, I don't think that would make a difference. So the short answer is you're going to have to pay them the greater of average earnings or ordinary earnings for their month of leave after they come back. Pam asks, kia ora Pam, thank you for coming along. If an employee is on ACC, can I ask that the 5th day of their working leave is paid as sick leave or annual leave? Thanks, Pam. Yes, that's right. So an employee on ACC will have 80% of their earnings paid to them by ACC, and then the 5th day they can ask to be topped up by their employer. If it's sick leave, you sort of have to approve that, so I would sign off on that. If it's annual leave, you can choose to approve or decline. The benefit of approving is you're keeping this employee happy and you're getting your balance sheet down, but it is a bit of a whack on your cash flow. So you can choose to decline annual leave. The employee is probably going to get pretty cranky. But if it's sick leave, you do have to approve it. Cool. More information about the public holiday night shift question. Great, thank you. So the night shift, the following night that starts on the public holiday is the day that they get their public holiday entitlements on the night. Gotcha. We close the night before as the night shift loads the delivery trucks, and on a public holiday, we don't do deliveries, so no trucks to load. So Sunday, so I'm just going to pan this out and make sure I've got it correct. Sunday night, there are no delivery trucks to load because you don't do deliveries on a public holiday. And then Monday comes, public holiday, the night shift get their public entitlements for that night. So they are paid a day not to work. And then Tuesday, kind of business as usual. So as long as they are being paid a public holiday for the fact that they're not working a shift on those few days, that's okay. If the public holiday means that their hours are dropped by another shift because of the timings of your warehouse operations, if you in your employment agreement have minimum hours that you need to pay them, you'll need to make up those hours elsewhere. So that might be extra hours later in the week. It might be some of them doing a day shift somewhere if that's acceptable to them. But basically, if the public holiday results in 2 shifts being cut and they only get paid for 1 shift as the public holiday entitlement, you'll need to either top them up for that second shift or make up the hours elsewhere, unfortunately. I hope that answers your question, but please drop me an email afterwards if I've missed any detail there. Cool. Carol asks, could the union be offered a come and talk to any staff at a lunchtime kind of vibe, and staff can choose whether they want to go and listen? Yes, that's correct. So unions have again, a right to access your workplace under certain conditions and a right to talk to staff. Often unions, like 2 or 3 times a year, will do a bit of a presentation on the union and what the benefits are and what's involved and how it all works. So staff can choose to go, that's fine. Staff can choose not to go, that's also fine. But as long as no one's being bullied or harassed, then that's kind of the key issue. Your next question, Carol, is about once the union has had a chance to speak to staff, they can be told to stop harassing you. I think that's true. I'm going to go and just double check and make sure I'm not sending you up shit creek there by giving you advice to tell the union to back off, because that can be quite an inflammatory comment to make. So leave that with me. I'll go back and have a look, and then I will come through with some answers in the final documents there. Cool. Phew, that's 20 questions answered. Thank you, everyone. This is a very boring 10 minutes for us if no one puts any questions through. We're at the end of our time. Well, we're at the end of our questions, but we still have 17 minutes on the clock if anything else comes through. So if you've had your question answered and you're good to go, you are welcome to drop off and carry on with the rest of your day. If you would like to ask another question, you're very welcome. I've got some more time here. I'll just take a quick break and check an email I was expecting to come through. Then I can come back and answer these final questions. So thanks for joining us. If you're signing off now, if you want to ask another question, this is your chance, and I will stick around and answer anything else that comes through. That's some super exciting dead air for those of you who stuck around. Kyla says, this has been great. Thank you. You're so welcome, Kyla. Thank you for coming along. I'm glad that you enjoyed it, and hopefully you got something useful out of it. Anonymous asks, how do investigation processes look for complaints when dealing with employees who are part of a union? So I might need some more detail there, Anonymous, if you wouldn't mind flicking through a bit more context. Broadly, employees who are part of a union have access to the union for representation and advocacy within the workplace. They are still subject to the policies and rules and processes of the employer, right? So if the employer is conducting an investigation, whether it's off the back of a complaint from another employee, whether it's because something has come to their attention and they need to resolve it, the employer has a right to talk to their employees and see if they know anything about the complaint or the issue or whatever it might be they're investigating. Normally, if they are conducting that investigation and they want to speak to people who are members of the union, they will typically let the union know just to kind of proactively manage communications. And then those employees will attend typically an investigatory meeting as a witness, and the employer or the employer's investigator or lawyer or HR person will go through a series of questions to see if they know anything about the complaint or the issue, the safety issue, whatever it is. So the only difference is that sometimes you might want to proactively communicate with the union that this is happening, and potentially the employee might want to bring along a representative from the union just to be in the meeting with them if that would help them feel comfortable. And that might mean that you need to schedule the meeting around the rep's time, which can be a bit frustrating. But beyond that, there's no difference to involving employees who are part of a union as part of an investigation process. Just the scheduling of it might be a little bit different. Paul asks, good Paul, thank you for coming along. If you have someone who in July did not meet performance standards, and you pull them up about that, and now they're not meeting standards again for something different this time, can you go formal and pull in the aspects from July? So kind of is the answer. So the performance issues that happened in July sound like they were dealt with at the time, right? And July was 3 months ago now, so they're pretty old in terms of how long ago that they happened. So in the disciplinary, you can't say we're telling you off and potentially issuing you a warning for these issues that happened in October. And we're potentially telling you off and issuing you a warning. As part of the warning, we're disciplining you for the issues that happened in July. So you can't do that. You dealt with them in July. You had a chance to address them then and you chose not to, or you chose to do it informally or formally, totally fine. But you can't punish someone for the same thing twice. So you dealt with it then, you can't re-include it now. However, if when dealing with those performance issues in July, you had a conversation where you said, look, my expectations are that you show up to work on time, that you proofread the invoices that you set out, that you like, here are my expectations, are we clear? In the October disciplinary, you can say that you knew that this new issue wasn't acceptable because I had reset my expectations for you in July. So if there's overlap between the July issue and the October issue, in terms of the employee kind of knows it's not okay because of what was discussed in July, you can include that here as a you should have known better part of the disciplinary. But in terms of the reasons for potentially issuing the warning, you can't include what happened in July. It was dealt with then, you talked about it with them then, you can't punish someone for the same person twice. Nicole says, how would you describe what a complex ER issue is? Is it down to the type of issue, scale, risk, etc.? I've never been asked that question, Nicole. I'm going to have to think about that. I would describe an ER issue as complex either when there's a high degree of unpredictability about the person involved, when there are multiple laws that apply to the situation that need to be interpreted, the scale of like a large restructure involving 20 people is complex because of the number of moving parts, or because of the consultation process required and what's coming up during that consultation process. So I think complexity can come from different angles. If I'm running a disciplinary process with someone who is maybe a bit rubbish at their job, but a good human who's not trying to be a difficult employee, that process is going to be less complex than if I'm running one with someone. I've got a case I'm managing with a client at the moment who is unpredictable, very erratic, can get very aggressive and shout at their employer, has been contacting clients kind of making disparaging remarks about his boss and about the company. Like, all of those elements make the process more complex, even though what I'm doing here is the same thing. I'm just trying to hold someone to account for not meeting their standards at work. But with the person who's not a difficult person, you can do that. You can have a meaningful adult conversation about it. Whereas with someone who is unpredictable, erratic, maybe there's mental health challenges or substance abuse challenges going on, the issues aren't complex, but the process can be, because of the way that they can shoot off and throw a spanner in the works and go at MIA for 2 days and don't talk to you, and then you have to manage the time. Like, that can make a process complex, even though the issues aren't. And then where there are situations where multiple laws apply, that can get complicated because you're trying to manage, what the Holidays Act says, how leave must be treated, combined with a business who's trying to manage a close down. So the close down piece is in there. Then they're trying to manage a performance. Like, you can see how it can get quite interconnected quite quickly. And then in terms of scale, often managing change in a business affects more than one person. So if you're changing your strategy to outsource your business, or to what might be another example, if you're having to shimmy around a bunch of people's responsibilities because you've now had this new technology that makes working a lot more straightforward, or a lot more automated, that can be complex, not because the issues are complicated, the story's reasonably straightforward, but I'm having to consult with 20 individual people about what they think about the change, what their response is. Some people might be fine with it. Some people might get really aggro. Some person might suddenly throw like a whole bunch of fresh allegations at the business because they've added up to here and this is kind of the final straw. So that can get really messy. So if it's a difficult person, if it's a complex consultation process, if there's a lot of scale, or if a lot of different laws apply, I think that is when I would start to use the word complex. Yeah, I think that's how I would describe that. I'm sure I could be more succinct given a bit more time to think about it, but that's my off the cuff response. Anonymous asks, can we do anything about staff that are just walking out at 4 o'clock, which is their rostered end time, even though there are still trucks to load? We don't want to change the roster, as it only happens, say, once a fortnight, but it means the few staff who do stay on have to finish off by themselves, and we pay the extra time. Yes. So if you are, if it happens every once in a while and you are paying the staff either their normal rate or an overtime rate for doing those extra hours, you can totally require that they stay around until the job is finished. Depending on what's in their employment agreement, that might require a consultation process. It might just be a chat at your all hands meeting to go, hey guys, we've noticed that the same few people will stick around to finish the truck loading when there's extra. We expect that everyone stays around to finish, so that it's not 2 people working 5 extra hours, it's 10 people working 1 extra hour, whatever the numbers are, and you're paid for that time, so you are required to stick around. So check what's in their employment agreement around availability for additional hours, whether they're compulsory or optional, and then make a decision from there. And if you're a client of ours, get in touch. We can help you manage that conversation. That's all cool. Anonymous asks, can performance reviews be used as examples of poor performance in disciplinary process? It sort of depends. So if someone has had, like a week ago, a really, really bad performance review, and the manager has only just, through the performance review process, been aware of how shit a job this person was doing, and it's fresh information, then yes, you can run a disciplinary off the back of that to say, you're not meeting your sales targets, you're not meeting your deliverables. I had no idea this was happening until we've done the performance review, so we're going to kick off a disciplinary process. Broadly though, if you're running your performance reviews, I don't want to say professionally, but effectively, there should never be any surprises for the employer or the employee going into a performance review meeting. The expectations were set, 3 months ago, 6 months ago, 12 months ago. The manager has been having regular catch-ups with the employee to see how they're tracking on their goals and objectives. They're sort of having regular conversations with people about between each other about it. And so as and when those issues show up 6 months into a 12-month performance review, if the employee isn't meeting the standards expected of them, that's when you should be running the disciplinary process. You shouldn't be waiting another 6 months to conclude the performance review, because then you're in the position of going, We knew that these problems were happening. We were in regular communication with you about it. It's now December and we're trying to run a disciplinary for cock-ups from February, April, June, July, November. Like, that's not reasonable. You kind of need to address them as and when they show up. So if the performance review has sparked or has uncovered a bunch of performance issues and problems, yes, you can run a disciplinary then, depending on what they are. But if it's been a long running saga and you're now wrapping it up with a significant delay, I would typically recommend against that, because kind of you've missed your chance. Like, if there were issues in April, if there were issues in June, July, that's when you needed to be addressing them, not waiting until December. Rachel asks, if you receive a formal complaint about a staff member from another staff member, should you raise this with the accused before the formal letter of invitation to meet? That's a great question, Rachel. It's another it depends answer. So if you have a complaints policy for managing how you'll deal with complaints, follow whatever that policy says. If your policy says any complaints about other members of staff will be directly sent to them so they can review them and then we will meet, that's fine. I would typically, though, expect that the first time the accused hears of the complaint is at a meeting where you're sharing this information with them. So depending on what your policy says, sort of follow what that says. If you don't have a policy, which most small businesses don't, like complaints policies tend to be for much larger organizations, then it's a little bit of finding your way through a few different obligations. So you have an obligation to the complainant, the person who's complained, to investigate their complaint, address it, sort of figure out a way forward. But you also have an obligation to the accused, who's an employee of yours, right? To give them all the information that you have accessible, to give them the right to face their accused, like to kind of deal with the complainant face to face, and to give them a chance to respond in a way that's meaningful. So depending a little bit on how the complainant wants this whole thing managed will affect the timings of when you share that complaint with the accused. It might be at a meeting, it might be in a heads up. If the complaint was just a, God, Sylvie's pissing me off this week, can you have a chat to her because I'm sick of cleaning up all of her admin messes? I wouldn't call that a formal complaint, and so you can probably just have a chat to that person and not share it with them. If it's I am formally complaining about Sylvie's behavior, she has been bullying me for 6 months, here is my 6-page list of all the instances where she has bullied me. Like, if it's a version of that, then probably best to do it in a meeting to say, hey, we've received a complaint, we're letting you know about it, here's what we've received, here are the next steps, do you have any questions? So again, sort of depends on context. Follow a policy if you have one, and if not, have a bit of a think about the timings of when you communicate this to everyone, and work with the employee who has complained to make sure that they understand what's happening and that they're comfortable with what's about to happen. Shannon says, hey Sylvie, love this. Thanks, Shannon. Always nice to see you pop up in our questions. You mentioned earlier a light touch consultation process. Can you please elaborate? What constitutes a consultation process compared to a chat where a change is suggested and accepted? Great question. For me, a light touch consultation process is all about tone. So if I was working with a team that I trusted and was really comfortable with, and the change wasn't significant, at a weekly whip, I might say, hey, everyone, we're thinking about making XYZ change where, in the My HR world, calls that come in from customers about technical issues. How do I access my account? How do I access performance reviews? Where can I find this information in my account? All of those calls are sent to our customer success team rather than our HR advisory team. How does everyone feel about that? Is that kind of cool? Any questions? Let me know in a couple of days and I'll make a decision then. So I'm still proposing something. I'm still asking for their feedback and giving them time to think about it, but I'm not issuing them letters. I'm not saying they have a right to seek legal advice. Like, I'm not kind of doing a full-blown formal consultation process, because the issue is pretty minor. It doesn't affect their T's and C's, like it's not pay or location or hours of work stuff. It's just about sort of job content. And it's a team that I trust and whom I know have enough savvy to know that if they had genuine concerns, they would flag them to me and kind of we could deal with it then. So you can manage all kinds of processes that require consultation, either through formal paperwork, formal documentation, all that sort of stuff. Or you can manage them, it's still consultation, but the tone is much more informal and there's much less kind of admin involved. What's appropriate depends on how significant the change is, who you're dealing with, sort of the story you're having to tell to explain it. If it's quite a complicated story or if it's a bit elaborate, I'd put it in a formal process. So by light touch, I just mean less formal. I don't mean skipping any of the propose, feedback, make a decision kind of steps. I hope that clarifies. Carol asks, does the legislation which applies to a business still apply to a not-profit? For example, how long you need to keep employee documentation, and is this formally or clearly stated in any legislation anywhere? That's a great question, Carol. So any entity, whether that's a limited liability company, whether it's a partnership, whether they're a sole trader, whether they're a trust, whether they're a registered charity, if they employ people and have employment relationships with workers, they are subject to all of the employment laws that apply to private businesses. So that includes annual leave, it includes laws around how you manage deductions from pay, it includes laws around how long you are required to store documentation for. So regardless of the type of organization, partnership, limited liability, government agency, any of that kind of stuff, if you have employment relationships with your workers, that triggers that triggers all of those employment laws to apply. Specifically speaking, and that's stated in the legislation. So if you go to the Employment Relations Act, at the beginning of the act, it outlines who is an employer, who is an employee, what work is for deciding both of those two things. So if your organization fits that criteria, you are an employer. And if you have employment relationships with people, by default, that will apply. Specifically to your question around storing documentation, how long do you need to keep employment documents for? 6 years. So employment records must be stored for 6 years. If after that period of time, that person is still working for you, you can delete anything older than 6 years if you want to. Often that's a bit of a pain. People just tend to keep employment documents for 6 years after someone's resigned and then delete the whole thing. But employment records need to be stored for 6. Tax records, including PAYE and KiwiSaver, need to be stored for 7 years. Most times businesses will just choose to keep employment records, the whole employee file for 7 years because of that PAYE tax kind of student loan deduction sort of piece in there. So a minimum of 6, typically for 7. If the person's still employed with you, you can delete anything older than 6 years. That's a bit of a hassle. So most of the time people just keep them for 6 or 7 years after the person has left their employment. Let's have a look. Last few questions. Oh, we are now over time, so I'll do one more and then we'll wrap up. Another question about employee documentation. When did that change from being kept for 10 years after they leave? I've been working in HR since 2013 and it's been 6 years for that whole time, so 11 years at least. I'm not aware of there being a change in that law before that time, but I can do a bit of Googling and see if that's changed. But at the moment, the requirement is to keep it for 6 years for employee records and 7 for tax. If it was being kept for longer than 10 years, I'm sorry, I don't have the historical context there, but at least since 2013, it's been 6 years or 7. Cool. Phew. There's a couple last comments here, which I'm sorry I won't have time to get to, but thank you so much for coming along. It's been a really robust session. I'm really pleased we were able to fill the hour there. So I trust that you've found something useful for your situation or you've learned something from hearing me talk about other contexts. Again, we will do I'm not sure if we have another webinar scheduled before Christmas, but if you're on our mailing lists, you'll hear about it. If I don't speak to you before then, I wish you a very, very comfortable, wonderful Christmas, summer, festive period with your family and loved ones. And if this conversation has sparked any questions, you're welcome to get in touch with me directly. I'm Sylvie, SYLVIE, at myhr.works. Again, Sylvie at myhr.works. We can have a conversation. Otherwise, keep an eye out for the recording of the session and we will do our very best to get a transcript together and have everyone's questions compiled in a slightly more thoughtful way. So thank you again. Have a wonderful afternoon. Ka kite for now, and I look forward to seeing you soon. We'll speak next time.